So I'm delighted to welcome you all to this afternoon's lecture. It's the third in the series of invited talks by finalists for our advertised position in linguistics. As I keep stressing, through these lectures and the successful culmination of this search, we hope to enrich and strengthen the department's profile in language contact and bilingualism in Iberia and the Americas. Today's guest is Antje Muntendam. She's assistant professor at Radboud University Nijmegen in the Netherlands, where she holds appointments in the Department of Linguistics, the Department of Romance Languages, and the Department of Communication and Information Sciences. Prior to that, she held an appointment in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Middlebury College. As these appointments would suggest, Antje's teaching, mentoring, and research span across disciplines. In her current post, Antje teaches an array of core and specialized courses, including undergraduate offerings such as From Sound to Word and Lengua, Cultura y Sociedad, and graduate seminars such as Receptive Multilingualism and Lifelong Learning Practices, Second Language Acquisition, and Attrition. And she directs graduate, their doctoral NMA theses and supervises undergraduate candidates in honors and field research in Latin America. As a scholar, Antje situates her research within the fields of bilingualism and language contact, with specializations in SLA syntax, syntax phonology interface, and Quechua-Spanish contact linguistics. She initiated her post-baccalaureate studies with an MA at Leiden in the Department of Languages and Cultures in Latin America, this under the tutelage of the leading scholar in language contact, Peter Meisken. She began with linguistics and soon added psychology as a second major, which allowed her to develop a keen grasp of research design and of quantitative and statistical analyses. During that period, too, she participated in a year abroad at the Universidad Católica in Lima, where in addition to pursuing coursework in Quechua studies, she conducted fieldwork in Bolivia. Recognizing her promise as a scholar, Peter Meisken encouraged Antje to pursue doctoral degree, and she enrolled in and completed the curriculum at the University of Illinois with rigorous training in field methods, syntax, pragmatics, and bilingualism, and she continued to develop her Quechua skills with regular trips, really like 9 or 11 trips, to the Andes. Her dissertation research culminated in the thesis Linguistic Transfer in Andean Spanish, which was defended with high honors and resulted in multiple publications that appear in the top-tier journals such as Bilingualism, Language and Cognition, and the International Language of Bilingualism, and chapters in important compendia with titles such as The Prosody of Focus in Spanish Quechua Bilinguals, On the Nature of Cross-Linguistic Transfer, and Discourse Deixis in Southern Quechua. Since returning to the Netherlands, Antje has expanded her research into the domain of laboratory phonology, which has led to several experimental investigations on Dutch-Turkish bilinguals. One such collaborative effort, the effect of stress location on cognate processing, has been submitted to the Journal of Memory and Language. This further foregrounds her ability to relate theoretical and applied issues with data from both Western and non-Western languages. In today's talk, Antje will share with us her considerable knowledge of Quechua and Andean Spanish contact and of word order and its relation to prosody and discourse. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Again, I was here 10 years ago. So the title of my talk is Quechua-Spanish bilingualism, prosody and focus, insights from an interactive elicitation task. So we'll start with an introduction about Quechua-Spanish bilingualism, a brief explanation of what prosody is, and an overview of previous research on bilingualism and prosody. I will then define focus and discuss focus strategies used in Quechua and in Spanish. And after presenting my research questions, I will discuss the methodology I use for collecting my data. And then I will present the results for the prosodic marking of focus in Peninsular Spanish, which is my control group, Quechua and bilingual Peruvian Spanish, and then I will end with a summary and a discussion of conclusions. So I focus on Quechua-Spanish bilingualism. Quechua is the name of a language family rather than just one language, so there are about 21 different Quechua languages. And these are spoken from southern Colombia to northern Chile and Argentina, with different groups of speakers, mostly in Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. And the number of speakers is estimated between 10 and 13 million, and this includes both bilinguals and monolinguals. So most of them are actually bilingual in Spanish and in Quechua. So there's been contact for almost 500 years, and there's an asymmetrical relation, so there's a shift towards Spanish, which is now the dominant language. So if you look at Quechua and Spanish, there are important typological differences. So just to mention a few, Spanish has five vowels, whereas Quechua has 3 vowels. There's a difference in argument marking, so Spanish really relies on word order and doesn't have case marking, except for some exceptions. Whereas Quechua has case marking, so nominative case is unmarked, but accusative case and oblique case is unmarked. And then there are also differences in nominal word order and clausal word order, and also differences in how they express important information in a sentence, so information structure. And so these typological differences between the two languages have led to cross-linguistic influence at different levels. So the different varieties of Spanish have emerged, which have an influence on Quechua, and there are different varieties of Quechua which are effective in Spanish, and there are also different mixed varieties of Spanish and Quechua, and these are mostly spoken outside the core area of Peru. And so in this study I'm going to focus on bilingual Peruvian Spanish, and I use this term to refer to the speech of bilingual Quechua-Spanish bilinguals. So as I said, I'm going to talk about cross-linguistic influence in the prosodic domain, so it's important to know what prosody means. So prosody refers to rhythm, stress, intonation. Intonation is, practically speaking, the melody of an utterance, so variation in pitch that changes the meaning of a sentence. Pitch is determined by the rate of vibration for vocal folds. So if you have a faster rate of vibration, you get a higher pitch or a higher tone. And if you have a lower rate of vibration, you get a lower tone. And the acoustic correlate, which I'm going to talk about in this talk, is a fundamental frequency for F0. So that basically refers to the tone, so a high tone or low tone. So as we speak, our tone, the tone of our sentences changes constantly. So you have sequences of high and low tones. And in some languages, these differences in intonation, these differences in high and low tones, can affect the meaning. So they affect the meaning of the sentences. So in Spanish, if you have a sentence, llegaron tus amigos, with a falling intonation, you have a statement, your friends arrived. If you say llegaron tus amigos with a rising intonation, then it means did your friends arrive? And so you have the exactly same sentence, but with different intonation, and that leads to differences in meaning. And so you can also use intonation to highlight new information or important information in the sentence. And I will get back to that later. So in this talk I'm going to use the autosegmental metrical approach to intonation, and in this approach you have basically high tones and low tones, so you represent them with H and L, and you have combinations of these tones. Then you have an asterisk that indicates that the tone is associated with a stress syllable. So if you have an H with a star, then it means that the high tone or tone group is associated with a stress syllable. And L with a star means the low tone or tonal value associated with stress syllable. And then another thing to know is the percentage mark is a vowel tone. And so, for example, this indicates a low vowel tone. So if you have a sentence like this one,
miraban a Mariano.
Then you can present that in Praat with this contour, where you have first a rising accent with the stress, with the peak in the postonic syllable, and then you have a lower accent, and then you have a low boundary tone. So in addition to this, you can also have different prosodic features that lend prominence to the stress syllable. So for example, F0, intensity, and duration. So intensity is the loudness, so you can speak louder and less loud, and duration is basically the length of a syllable. Okay. So traditionally, there have not been that many studies on cross-linguistic influence in the prosodic domain. So recently, there have been some studies, and these show that the prosodic system of a language can be affected by contact with another language. So there are these studies that I mentioned here. They will focus on different language pairings, and they have different linguistic outcomes. So, for example, Queen 2001 showed that contact between German and Turkish resulted in fusion, where you have one system that combines elements from German and from Turkish, so from two systems. Another study, Elicited, showed that Spanish and Basque contact led to a new system, where you have a system that's different from Spanish and different from Basque. And then there are also studies that show that there's convergence, where languages become more similar. So they're basically taking over patterns from one language in the other language. So the studies on prosodic convergence concern typologically close languages. So Colantoni and Corlegion focused on Italian and Spanish. Simonet focused on Spanish and Catalan. So the question is, what happens when you have typologically different languages that use different strategies? So that's what I'm going to do in this talk. I'm going to look at Quechua and Spanish, which are typologically different languages, and they are said to use different focus strategies. And I'm going to look specifically at the use of prosody to encode Praat focus and contrastive focus in Spanish and Quechua, and I will explain focus in a minute. And I'm going to look specifically at noun phrases consisting of an adjective and a noun. So focus is basically the new information of the sentence, or the non-presupposed information. So the rest of the sentence is shared information between the speaker and the listener. And you can use question and answer verbs to elicit the focus structure of a sentence. So the focus of a sentence is basically the element that replaces the WH element in the question. So if you have a sentence like in Greek, "Que pasó?" what happened, the answer "Juan leyó un libro" is in Praat focus. So the focus is on the entire sentence. Everything is new information. If you have a sentence as in for, "Que leyó Juan?" what did Juan read? You elicit focus on just one constituent or one word, and that's narrow focus. So Juan leyó un libro, here the focus is on libro, that's the new information. And then you can also have contrastive focus, for example in 5, Juan leyó una revista, no Juan leyó un libro, no una revista. So no, John read a book, not a magazine. So there you have new information, but you also have a negation, so you have a contrast. So that's contrastive focus. So different languages use different strategies to encode focus. So in Quechua, focus is expressed in morphology, so the use of focus particle, on me, and it's encoded in syntax, so you can use different word orders. So in 6, the basic word order SOP is used, and there is a focus particle on the object. So the object is marked in situ. In 7, it is a house that Pedro Wilson has the same meaning. Here, the focus element, recitan, is moved to the beginning of the sentence. So you can also express focus in syntax. In this talk, I'm going to look at noun phrases. So in noun phrases, focus is not encoded syntactically or morphologically. So the word order in noun phrases is always fixed. So you always have the adjective before the noun, as in this example, come adjusted. The focus marker me can also not be used within constituents. So you cannot use morphological markers. So in 8, this man is a good person. You have a focus marker on good man in the entire noun phrase. So you can focus the entire noun phrase as focus, but you cannot just focus the adjective as in nine. So you cannot say this man is a good person with a focus on good. So this is important because that means that in the study, the participants cannot use syntax or morphology. They can only use prosody or nothing at all. And then previous research on prosody of Cusco Quechua have shown that declaratives have a falling contour, so the intonation is going down at the end of the sentence. Our work has also shown that most beats are downstepped, so they're lower than the previous beats, but some are upstepped, so some are higher than the previous beat. And most beats fall within the stress syllable. Then our work 2005 did not find any evidence for correlation between prosody and focus in Cusco Quechua. But then it should be noted that her study is based on broad focus and some cases of narrow focus, but it was always narrow, non-contrastive focus. So she did not look at contrastive focus. And we don't have any other information about contrastive focus in Cusco Quechua. Then Spanish is different from Quechua in the sense that focus is encoded in syntax, so you can change the word order, and in prosody. So in syntax, you can, for contrastive focus, use the word order OVS, el libro leo Juan y no la revista, where you have a contrastive stress on el libro. So you get a contrastive interpretation. And there have also been found differences in intonation between broad focus and contrastive focus. So broad focus, according to Esteros Villaplana and Prieto, is marked by a rising accent with a delay between a postonic syllable followed by a low accent, followed by a low boundary tone, and all the non-final peaks fall in the postonic syllable. And this is important because contrastive focus in non-final position has a high accent with a peak within the stressed syllable. And the contrastive focus in final position has a prominent high accent instead of the low accent that you see in broad focus. So you have differences in intonation contour between broad focus and contrastive focus. And furthermore, you can use F0 scaling. So contrastive focus is associated with a higher F0 scaling, increased duration of the stressed syllable of the word, or a higher intensity in different varieties of Spanish. So you can also use phonetic varieties. So our work 2005-2012 did a study on bilingual Peruvian Spanish, and she showed that most peaks in bilingual Peruvian Spanish fall within the stressed syllable, regardless of focus type, so always fall in the stressed syllable. And she found a higher F0 pitch and pitch range for broad focus than for contrastive focus. So that's the opposite of what you would expect for other varieties of Spanish. So her results suggest that bilingual Peruvian Spanish is different from monolingual Spanish, and that's possibly due to Quechua. Her research is based primarily on read speech, like most research in intonation research. And this task I'm going to use an interactive elicitation test. So read speech has some advantages, so you can get a lot of data, comparable data, and you can do a semi-automatic analysis. But the question is if it's really natural. So in this study, also because most of my participants are low literate or low educated, we used a different test that does not involve any data. So it's an interactive elicitation test that elicits noun phrases in both Praat and contrastive focus. It was basically a game that was played in pairs between two participants, and then it had a goal, and I will explain the game in a little bit. The game also allowed us to use the same task for different languages, so for Quechua, for bilingual Peruvian Spanish, and for Peninsular Spanish, so we could get comparable data. So then the specific research questions are, to what extent do Quechua-Spanish bilinguals use prosody to distinguish between broad and contrastive focus in Quechua and Spanish? And is bilingual Peruvian Spanish affected by language context? And if so, how? So I did a study of prosody of noun phrases in Quechua, bilingual Peruvian Spanish, and a control group of Peninsular Spanish. So the data were collected in Quechua in Peru. It's a small community close to Cusco, about 10 miles west of Cusco. It has a population of about 480 inhabitants, and it's characterized by a high degree of Quechua-Spanish bilingual, so most people are bilingual. I used the socially linguistic background questionnaire to select the participants. So in this questionnaire, I asked questions about participant age, their age of acquisition of Quechua and Spanish, their language use, language proficiency, their family background, education and occupation. So the participants were 16 Quechua-Spanish bilinguals. Their ages ranged between 23 and 47 years. Half of them were male, half of them were female. Half of them were simultaneous bilinguals, so they learned both languages at the same time. And half of them were early sequential bilinguals. So these participants learned Quechua first, and then they learned Spanish when they started going to school. 6 professionals completed a higher education program. 3 participants started a higher education program and didn't finish it, so we coded them as a middle group, and 7 did not have more than elementary or secondary education, so they were coded as non-professionals. All participants use Spanish and Quechua on a daily basis, and most of them reported to be equally proficient in both languages. And as I said before, they were all low literate in Quechua and or Spanish. And these participants did the task both in Spanish and in Quechua. And then as a control group, I collected data from 8 Peninsular Spanish speakers. Their ages range between 20 and 23. 6 were male, 2 were female, and they were all raised monolingual. So the task was a game between 2 participants, and there were question and answer cards with different objects in different colors. So it looked like this. So both participants had a pile of cards, and I asked each other questions and gave answers in turns. So there was a screen in between the participants so they couldn't see each other's cards. The questions elicited broad focus, narrow contrastive focus, and narrow non-contrastive focus, but I'm only going to look at broad focus and contrastive focus. The contrastive focus on the noun and contrastive focus on the adjective. So this is what it looked like. So to elicit broad focus, participant A had a white card with a question mark on it, and in the instruction section they were instructed to ask the questions, what do you have, begins. And then participant B answered, for example, tengo un toro verde, I have a green ball. So in this sentence, in this answer, all the information is new. So it's broad focus. To elicit contrastive focus on the noun, the objects were different, but the color was the same. So participant A asked the questions, tienes un sol verde, do you have a green sun? And participant B answered, no tengo un toro verde. So you have a contrast between the noun in the answer with the noun in the question. So that elicits contrastive focus on the noun. And then for contrastive focus on the adjective, the objects were the same, but the colors were different. So for example, participant A asked, do you have an orange bull? And then participant B said, no, I have a green bull. So there you have the contrast between the colors. So you have a contrastive focus on the adjective. So there was no reading involved in this task. And then the participants also had an overview of all the objects in all the different colors. And that was basically just added to encourage the participants to describe the cards accurately so that they didn't mumble. And also to have some purpose to the game. So they actually thought they could win, although the order was already determined. So there were 20 target noun phrases per condition, which yielded in total 60 noun phrases per participants. And in addition, there were question answers for narrow focus and also destructors. So the destructors were, for example, questions like, do you have 4 brown cats? Yes, I have 4 brown cats. Just to make sure that they could also answer the question with yes, or that they didn't really focus on it. So prior to the sessions, there was an instruction and there was a practice round. The Quechua and bilingual Peruvian Spanish data were recorded in the field. And the Peninsular Spanish data were recorded in a recording booth at the university. And the sessions lasted about 45 minutes per language. So for the analysis, we first looked at the intonation contours for the 3 language varieties. And we found specific intonation contours. So then the question was, are different focus conditions associated with specific contours? So we labeled all the contours following the autosegmental metrical notation that we saw before. And then we also took acoustic measures using Praat in both the first word and the second word of the noun phrase. So we looked at F0, duration, and intensity. And then to see if there were differences between focus condition, we also looked at differences in these 3 correlates. So F0, duration, and maximum intensity. So differences between first word and the second word. So it's important to realize that Spanish has the word order noun, adjective, and Quechua adjective, noun. And then for statistical analysis, we use mixed effect models in R. We had to exclude some data, so we excluded noun phrases with more than 2 content words. So some participants said de color rosado of the red color instead of just rosado. And there were also some utterances with pauses or hesitations that we excluded from the data. And then for Quechua, we analyzed only a subset of the data. So we only looked at words with penultimate stress. So in Quechua, words have penultimate stress, but that means that in nominative case, you don't have case marking. So in nominative case, it would be rosado nina, but if you add the suffix for accusative, the stress shifts, so you get rosado ninata. So to avoid differences in stress location, we only looked at words with penultimate stress and excluded the others. And then we also looked only at noun phrases in the sentence final position. So I'm going to turn now to the results. I'm going to discuss the results for Peninsular Spanish, for Quechua and bilingual Peruvian Spanish. I'm going to discuss first the different contours that we found when they were used, and then also the phonetic correlates. So for Peninsular Spanish, we found 3 different contours. So the first contour that we found has a prominent high accent on the stress syllable, the first stress syllable of the intonational phrase. And then there is a low accent, so usually you go to a low accent and a low boundary tone. So this sounds, oops. So it sounds like this.
No tengo un árbol amarillo.
So you hear a high accent on árbol. And in the literature, this has been described as a contour that leads contrastive focus, less contrastive focus on the word with a high prominent accent. Then the second contour that we found was a contour with two intonational phrases. So you first have a rising accent, then you have a high boundary tone, a downstep high accent, and then a low boundary tone. So this sounds like this.
Tengo una gallina rosa.
So you hear a small pause in between gallina and oso. And according to Walde 2005, this contour is used to separate given and new information in the sentence. And then the third contour that we found is this one,
Lluvia morada.
where you have a rising accent followed by a fall and then a low boundary. And this is according to the literature used for Praat. So then if we look at these contours, so this shows the frequency of these contours in Peninsular Spanish. This shows the same but just a little bit smaller. So we see that the first contour is used for broad focus, contrastive focus on the noun, but also for contrastive focus on the adjective. So it is used in the three focus condition. Then this contour is used more often for contrastive focus on the adjective than this contour, and this difference is statistically significant. And then the final contour is mostly used for contrastive focus on the noun, but it's also used for the different, for broad focus and for contrastive adjective. So it's also used in the three conditions. And we noticed that with the contour with the high prominent accent, it was not always the prominent accent on the noun. And sometimes it was either an hesitation or there was a prominent high accent on So for example, well, there was nothing to contrast it with. So this suggests that maybe it's not just marking focus, but maybe it's more general emphasis. And then we did an acoustic analysis of the F0, duration and intensity. We did a quantitative analysis only of the first contours, because for the other one we didn't have enough data points. And so for F0, we found a significant difference between broad focus and contrastive focus on the adjective, so a relatively higher F0 on the adjective, but only in this contour, right, where you have the broad focus. Duration, we found a difference between these two contours, between contrastive adjective and the other focus condition, right, but so it's for both contours. And for intensity, we did not find significant differences between focus conditions. And then for the third contour, which has the prominent high accent on the first syllable, we found a higher F0 scaling, a higher intensity, and a longer duration of the accented word. But that was regardless of the focus condition. So to sum up, we found in these contours, the first contour with the high accent was mostly used for a contrastive noun, but it was the least frequent of all the contours, and it was also used in other focus conditions, and it could be a more general form of emphasis. The contour with the two intonational phrases, where you have a pause in between the noun and the adjective, was mostly used for contrastive focus on the adjective, as is also been suggested in the literature. But if we look at the phonetic analysis of these contours, we found only phonetic correlates in the phrase final position, so only on the adjective, not for the noun. Now for Quechua, we found two different contours. So this is the first contour where you have a high accent on both the stressed syllables of both words. So this is an example.
Casa Mora Bruna.
And you see in the contour that both accents are relatively high. And then the second contour started with a low accent and then a rise here, and then a low boundary. So you hear a prominent accent on the second word, and that's in this case is that the noun, because in Quechua there are always adjective noun. So it sounds like this.
Kasami Rosadonina.
So you hear a high accent on the last word. This is in agreement with our work 2009, who also find higher peaks, upstep peaks in Quechua. So then if we look at the frequency of these contours, we see that this contour, the two high accent, is used more for Praat focus and contrastive focus on the noun. Oh, sorry. This one is used more for Praat focus and contrastive focus on the noun than the other one, but both contours are used equally for contrastive focus on the adjective. So this suggests that the contours are not correlated with focus type. And we also found some variation between the speakers. And so this contour with the high accent on the noun in Quechua is used mostly by two Quechua dominant speakers. So these speakers use more Quechua than Spanish. So for the acoustic analysis, for F0 we did not find differences between the focus condition. For the duration, we found that the noun, so the final word, was longer than the adjective, especially in the contour with the two high accent, regardless of focus condition. And the difference was larger in the condition contrastive focus on the noun. For intensity, again, we found statistically significant differences between the two contours, but this was again regardless of focus condition. So, to sum up the results for Quechua, there were two contours, but there didn't seem to be a systematic correspondence between the contour type and the focus condition, so all contours were used in all conditions. And for the phonetic analysis, we found effective focus type, but again, effective focus type on duration, but again, only in final position. Then if we look at bilingual Peruvian Spanish, we found three contours. The first one had a high peak unstressed syllable of the first word, like you can have in Spanish, but then the second peak was relatively high, and that's different from Peninsular Spanish, where you have a low accent. The peak was within the stressed syllable, so the first peak was within the stressed syllable instead of in the past tonic stressed syllable. And this is exactly the same contour as you find in Quechua. So it's not like this.
Tengo un árbol amarillo.
And sometimes the contour was quite flat. Then the second contour that we found was similar as in Peninsular Spanish, so you have the two phrases with a higher boundary in between. So that sounds like this.
Una olla negra.
And the third contour was again a contour that we found in Quechua that we did not find in Peninsular Spanish. And this was the contour with the high accent on the second word. So in this case, that's the adjective. And this contour was mostly used by the speakers who also used this contour in Quechua.
Perro amarillo.
So you find you hear a more prominent accent on amarillo. So the contours of bilingual Peruvian Spanish correspond to the other two language varieties. So two of the contours correspond to Quechua and one corresponds to Spanish or Peninsular Spanish. And when we look at the frequency, we see that the contour with the two high accents is most frequently used for broad focus and contrastive focus on the noun. The contour with the two phrases is used for contrastive focus on the adjective, but there's no systematic correspondence. So this was what we also found for Peninsular Spanish. And the contour, this one with the high accent, is used in all focus conditions as in Quechua. But as you see, it's the least frequent contour. Then if you look at the acoustic analysis, again we did a quantitative analysis of only two of the contours, the most frequent ones. We see that for F0, there's a relatively higher F0 on the adjective in contrastive focus on the adjective in the contour with the two accents. There was a statistically significant difference for duration between contrastive adjective and the other condition. So the adjective, which was in final position, was increased when it was in focus. So again, it's only the final position. And then for intensity, we also found the high intensity of the adjective when we focus, so again, on the final position. And for the contour with the high accent on the second word, we found impressionistically that it was more prominent than the other word with regard to F0 scaling, duration, and intensity, but this was regardless of focus condition, as in Quechua. So to sum up the results for bilingual Peruvian Spanish, we found statistically significant differences for F0 duration and intensity. So these lead prominent to the adjective when in contrastive focus, but only the adjective. We did not find differences for contrastive focus in the noun, so only the final word received phonetic prominence related to focus. And that's the same in Peninsular Spanish and Quechua. Okay, so to sum up the results for the three language varieties, so we looked at prosodic marking of focus in Peninsular Spanish, Quechua, and bilingual Peruvian Spanish. And for the intonation contour, we found that some contours were used more in some focus conditions than in others. So the contour with the two intonational phrases in Peninsular Spanish and bilingual Peruvian Spanish was used more for contrastive focus with the adjective than for the other conditions. And the contour with the high prominent accent, first accent, in Peninsular Spanish was used more for contrastive focus than now. However, all these contours also occurred in the other condition within each of the language varieties. So, for example, the contour with the high prominent accent in the first word in Peninsular Spanish also occurred in both the contrastive focus and the adjective. So there's no systematic correspondence between these contours and the focus condition. So the question is it really marking focus, or is it marking something else, something more general? So for the phonetic analysis, we found some effects of focus type on the phonetic pronounciation of focus words, but only in final position. So for Peninsular Spanish, we found small differences in observed duration. For bilingual Peruvian Spanish, we also found differences in intensity, and for Quechua, we only found differences in duration. But so all these phonetic correlates are limited to the final position. So the adjective in Spanish and the noun in Quechua. And these effects are very small. So the question then is, can Spanish and Quechua listeners actually receive these small phonetic effects of contrastive focus? So if you give them a sentence, can they determine which WH question answers? And so for this, a perception study is needed, which I haven't done here, which I would like to do. Okay, so as for the effects of language context, we found two contours in bilingual Peruvian Spanish that were present in Quechua, but not in Peninsular Spanish. So the contour with the high prominent accent and the second high accent was found in bilingual Peruvian Spanish, but not in Peninsular Spanish. The peak was within the stress syllable, and it had a high final accent, exactly as in Quechua, and it was the most frequently used contour in Quechua as well. And then the contour with the prominent and high accent on the final word was the same as in Quechua, and it exists in Peninsular Spanish. So this shows that there is a prosodic convergence. So Quechua and Spanish become more similar, or Spanish becomes more similar to Quechua. And this is similar to prosodic convergence in other cases of language context. So for example, in Italian Spanish or Catalan Spanish. So this shows that prosodic convergence is possible in situations of typologically different languages that use different strategies. But the factors, we still don't know what factors condition the linguistic outcome of language context in the prosodic domain. So we see some differences between speakers, and it seems to have to do with language dominance, but there might be other factors. So this study contributes to generally the field of language context because it shows that there's prosodic convergence in situations of intense language context, widespread bilingualism, long-term contact, and a contact between typologically distant languages. It shows here that the direction of transfer goes from Quechua to Spanish, and more research is needed to look at transfer from Spanish to Quechua. And it also shows that there's some interspeaker variation, but we still need to look at the different factors. Then it also contributes to the to what we know about prosodic marking of focus in Peninsular Spanish, Quechua, and Peruvian Spanish. For Peninsular Spanish, we found some results that differ from previous research, and so that raises the question whether we have to, whether we deal with like really prosodic marking of focus or whether it's something else. And then also because we used an elicitation task instead of red speech, the question is what should we use in intonation research? So we use the interactive elicitation task and we get relatively natural speech. We could use the same task for different language varieties. And because we have a task that does not involve reading, you can use it for different languages. You can do cross-linguistic studies and have comparable data. So the use of naturalistic or more naturalistic data I think would be good for intonation research, but always in combination with other data types. So finally, I to mention that research has been funded by different grants, and I would like to thank Francisco Torreira for help with the analysis, Raymond van Rijswijk for help with the data collection, participants from Peru and Spain, and Rafael Mercado from Centro Barcelona y Las Casas in Peru.
Could you clarify a little bit when you're talking about the analysis you did and determining between the different focus types? So that was just on the word that was focused or whatever. So it was just on the noun for nouns that we're talking about.
So we looked at took the measurements at the noun and the adjective, or adjective and noun, word order, and then we looked at the difference in F0, difference in maximum intensity, and difference in duration.
Okay.
Between those, and we compared that between conditions.
All right. So but you also put up the Toby of it.
Right.
But that was for the entire phrase, the Toby, or
for the noun phrase. Yes.
For the noun phrase.
Yeah, for the noun phrase.
Okay. One thing that I noticed when I was looking, particularly at the Peninsular Spanish and a little bit in the Peruvian Spanish, and maybe you could comment on this a little bit, is that the word that didn't seem to be in the focus one, whether it was so if the noun was focused, the following adjective or whatnot, it seemed to have a very flat intonation.
The adjective had a flat intonation?
For example, you had the phrases, the ones in Peninsular Spanish, the tengo un árbol amarillo.
Yeah.
And the amarillo at the end was very flat and whatnot.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you have looked outside of just the word that was focused to see what's happening in the rest of the phrase. What that word might be in focus.
So there was nothing after it, but we haven't really looked at what was before the noun phrase, except for that we noticed that, for example, the indefinite article sometimes had a really high accent, and we didn't look at like if there was tengo or yeah.
Did you see if there was any pattern or something that happened in the different focus contexts outside of, like you mentioned that high tone that you had on the article? Did it seem to be more higher in the contrastive focus or the broad focus, or just
no? It seems like if you just we haven't really done a quantitative analysis of like the own cases, and there were not that many cases, but it seemed like they just occurred in all focus conditions.
Okay. Well, I just asked this because I've seen work on Buenos Aires Spanish and also on Romanian where we're talking about focus, and they focus on what's happening outside of just that word that's being marked for focus. Like, for example, in Buenos Aires Spanish, in a broad focus, you get all the intonation contour.
Right.
But then when you go to contrastive focus, you just get that contour on the word that's being marked for focus, and the rest of the phrase is flat. Or in Romanian, they found that the word that's being marked for focus, nothing really happens to it. But when you're doing a contrastive focus, the rest of the phrase actually shrinks around it.
Okay.
It becomes smaller to make it sound. So
Right.
I think it would be interesting to look at the rest of the phrase as well and see what's happening.
Yeah.
So I'm not a linguist. That I think frames where my question is coming from. But what is your rationale for using Peninsular Spanish as your control group?
Yeah, I expected that question.
Plus, there's more than one Peninsular Spanish, right?
That too.
Yeah.
Right.
And given that Peninsular Spanish has shifted in the last 500 years since that contact was made first in Peru,
Yeah, so the main reason for not using Cusco Spanish, for example, was that even the local Cusco Spanish has already influence from Quechua. So even the Cusco Spanish spoken by monolinguals already has influence from Quechua.
What about limeño or like
Yeah, you
from another sentence?
like the entire actually in Peru, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, you already find like a different intonation because there has been so much contact for so long that I mean it's definitely something that I would quite like to do in the future to see what happens there, but then not Cusco Spanish. Because I mean basically I don't think.
Yeah, I would like to follow up on that. Excuse me. Another layman question, but following up a question.
Right.
Why do you speak of Peninsular Spanish as if it were one unit?
Right, exactly.
Especially, you took pains to show what village you researched your Quechua, 22 miles west of Cusco, but not where you researched Peninsular Spanish. And we know, for example, that Peninsular Spanish in Leon or Murcia are totally different.
Or Catalunya.
Or Catalunya.
Yeah, so Catalunya, we excluded all the bilingual areas, but yeah, I think it's mostly because like the studies that you see on Peninsular Spanish, most of them don't even mention where they got the data from. So they actually say Peninsular Spanish, or every now and then they say Madrid Spanish. But
doesn't that create a subalternization of Quechua vis-a-vis an alleged homogeneity of Peninsular Spanish that is an ideological bias?
Yeah, I agree with you. It would be, yeah, I mean, basically what I should have done is for Peninsular Spanish also mention exactly where the speakers come from. I don't remember exactly at the moment where they were from exactly. But yeah, so we excluded some areas, we excluded the bilingual areas, and like we collected the data at the university actually in the Netherlands. So there were students who just got to the Netherlands, so that were more Peruvians at that time. So we didn't go to a particular place in Spain to collect the data, which is something we could do in the future as well.
Or document where they come from.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I have the
Because
information.
otherwise
Just
that creates a sense that there's a certain homogeneity and
Right.
superiority of Peninsular Spanish vis-a-vis the heterogeneity of Quechua, which we know is different in the various parts of South America.
Right, which is not what I intend to say, obviously, that Peninsular Spanish is just one word.
Yeah, well, a corollary to that would be that anybody who hangs out, say, in Cordoba, there's actually an effective, pragmatic diglossia. I've seen people in Spain have very different Spanish when they're speaking in one social circumstance, with friends, with pals at the bar, and when they're speaking, giving a lecture in Spanish, for instance. I mean, that also would be a fact you would have to not only is there more than one Peninsular Spanish, but each Spaniard is capable of speaking two different varieties, two styles of Spanish, right?
Right, of course, but then the task is the same in the three language varieties. So it should still elicit the same kind of register, right? So it would not really make sense if the Peninsular Spanish speaker or the speakers that are from Spain use like a formal register and the speakers from Peru not. I mean, basically it's the same kind of task, the same kind of situation, so it would elicit the same register.
Another question, you showed that your Quechua bilingual group, there were a variety of genders, right?
Yes.
And genders, whereas the Peninsular group was
more biased towards
more 20 to 22 or something.
Right.
And they were mostly
yes.
Do you think that that has like age or generation or how many?
Right. So, I mean, ideally, we would get like a bigger group. Like it would also mean less participants, right? There were 8 participants. That was the 16 that we got for the language Peruvian Spanish. So ideally, I would balance it and get exactly the same amount of male and female, educated, non-educated. Oftentimes it's hard to match the bilingual speakers with other kind of other speakers because you always have the issue of low literate, different kind of circumstances. So like at this moment, this was the best we could do, but I agree with you that it would be ideal to have the same amount of participants and balance in terms of education, gender, and yes, yeah, they were universities, and so yeah, you already have a difference there.
But what about Quechua University students or writers, poets?
There are not that many Quechua University students, or there are not that many that speak Quechua, that still speak Quechua, or and usually because you find more Quechua influence in the more dominant Quechua speakers, these are the ones that don't study basically. So then probably you will find like different results. You wouldn't find that much influence in Quechua in university students if they speak Quechua.
Let me deflect the conversation a bit.
Okay.
Yeah, away from this, because I mean, at least you have a control for quite. You could argue you don't need one. What I would say, you don't need a monolingual control to work stand on its own. Comparing them to themselves in both languages.
Right.
So, but I do want to ask like social questions. So, out of curiosity, is there like some sort of Quechua ethnolect spoken in Peru? I mean, are there people who are not bilingual, but you know, without seeing them, they're, have a Quechua identity just from the way they speak?
Yeah, wait, so if you know that they speak Quechua just based on their Spanish?
Right,
would you
exactly.
go,
Well, no, they're not speak Quechua.
Right.
Like thinking like the equivalent of a Chicano English. So is there like a Quechuan Spanish?
There is
Chicano English speakers don't necessarily speak Spanish.
Right, so you have, that's why I didn't use the term Andean Spanish here. So Andean Spanish is also used for the regional variety, and that may include bilingual speakers and monolingual speakers. So those monolingual speakers actually sound like they have some influence from Quechua. And they have, of course, from Quechua, structures from Quechua.
But has anybody done any work to see conceptually just these varieties? Like, is there like an uber Quechua in Spanish? Like somebody projecting their identity to the
There is not a whole lot of work on reception. It's all production. And there's not a lot of experimental work. So recently there has been some more experimental work. But yeah, there have not been any reception studies. Which would be very interesting.
Thinking of duration and intensity and pitch and such, I think we're always making the assumption that language A and language B have the same basic pitch when you're speaking, or the same basic intensity, and so all of your measurements are relative to each other within the phrase.
Right.
But is there any evidence or anything that would indicate that in general, language A and language B, people speak at a lower pitch all the time? Or they speak louder in certain languages? Is there anything that says that language X actually speakers speak louder generally? Like loud Texans would speak their English a certain way compared to another place in the world, perhaps. Because it seems to me that there might be some differences in just the characteristic of the language in general, which isn't contrasted at all, but would be different. I was especially interested in the data on the intensity.
Right.
Is there anything that would say that, for example, Quechua speakers generally speak softer when they're speaking and not as loud?
I'm not sure, like impressionistically, I would say they speak softer and they speak a little flatter in intonation, but
And what I'm getting to is that wouldn't be something we would see in contrastive sort of study. That would be like a general average overall of the intensity that things were spoken or the pitch was spoken.
Right.
Maybe one of the reasons I'm thinking of this is I talked to a man recently, I believe he was from Sweden, who said, I don't like speaking English because I feel like my voice is too high.
Right.
And I had never thought of that as a linguistic feature, that when you speak another language you feel weird because now I have to speak at a higher pitch.
Well, there are differences between pitch ranges in different languages, right? I mean, like in English has usually pretty big.
But that's kind of pitch
difference.
range, which is
Pitch
different
range,
than
yeah,
the
but that
average
also
pitch I would speak at.
Right, but that makes that you sound like that you have a higher pitch.
So you're saying there is some idea that maybe Quechua speakers in general would speak softer than what Spanish speakers would.
I haven't really looked at it, so I'm not sure. But it would not like affect this question, right? It would be a different kind of question.
Well, only in the sense that if you are comparing prosody,
right.
that would be a prosodic feature that in a certain language or in a certain culture, people talk softer, for example. than
Right,
others.
so then you would think that in Spanish they maybe speak softer because in Quechua they speak softer.
Or if we are making a comparison of prosodic features, that would be one that would come into the comparison at some point, maybe.
There's a phenomenon called reservation English,
Yeah.
where tribal people on reservations in North America,
Right.
where they no longer speak the ancestral language, but their English is different than
Right.
surrounding standard English, whatever that might be in North America.
Right.
And
Just because
and
the-
you, when you they do speak lower.
Mhm.
Why? It could be a protocol, a custom, a stylistic preference, whatever.
Mhm.
But it is a feature you can isolate. It sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
I would like to offer an answer and then ask you a question.
Okay.
So there has been work done on Dutch and English, and it shows that
Mhm.
Dutch is generally spoken at a higher pitch than English, including bilinguals. And I don't mean to toot my own horn, but my dissertation is very similar to this, and it's with Spanish and Quiche bilinguals, basically the same thing. And the work in there shows that Quiche, when they're speaking Quiche, they always do it at a higher pitch than in Spanish, for whatever reason. They show a lot of convergence and a lot of other factors and stuff like that. And on that, I would ask you the question, because have you done any comparisons of Quechua and Spanish like to each other in across the different focus groups? It's like a comparison of Quechua to Spanish in the broad focus, or I mean, obviously you have to create your task where you have a word that was basically the same in both languages. I saw that when
There
your
are-
Quechua word was like Nina or something like that, which you could find a Spanish word that was quite similar, or at
Right,
least
or loan words maybe.
maybe, I
Or
don't know.
loan
But
words.
have you done across? any
No, but it's a
comparison?
very interesting suggestion. It would definitely be doable with like using loan words, for example. I mean, that's mostly the most, because other words, they're not really cognates, so you cannot use cognates or something. Maybe you could use loan words. That's an interesting suggestion.
Thank you very much.